Alright, woodworkers, so I have my mortise cleaned up, it's squared, it's been ready to go. Now I need to start transferring the location and dimensions to what will be my tenon material. So, so it would be very tricky to do this and start aligning these things freehand, and especially when dealing with a tenon, usually there's a corresponding tenon on the other end. And so what I want to do is make sure to get these things dialed in as accurately as I possibly can, otherwise I'm going to start getting bad alignment from one end to the other on the whatever piece I'm building. So, alright, so looking at the mortise here, this is kind of how we left it when we were cleaning everything up. And so we have layout lines and we've got top and bottom. But what I've done on the other face is I've put in some other identifying marks which are usually helpful for me. So what I've done is created a center line in the width, in the thickness of my mortise. So center line here, and if you remember, that was the center line that I was using when trying to determine the location of where this mortise is going to go. If I wanted it to be dead center in the board, then testing it on both sides or both edges, then that will create the center line that it was here. So I didn't redo that one. So I've just put a pencil line there to make this easier to see. What didn't exist prior to me coming on to this conversation was I put a center line here in the length, or I guess this would technically be the width of the mortise. And so dead center of location top and bottom. So that's going to make my life a whole lot easier for when I have to start laying out the tenon and where this thing goes. So first things first, the width of this board, I've made a center mark here, and so I want to carry that over to as close to the end of this as possible. And what I'm doing here is referencing off of both faces to make sure that my alignment is correct. And I said faces, but I actually meant edges. So I'm going in from the edges, finding the center. And I could do this with my marking gauge, but I find that the square, the adjustable blade on the square, makes this really easy, and I'm not committing to putting in some type of a scored line into the piece I'm working on. Okay, so I've got a center line, and it's kind of a heavy center line. Let's see if I can tweak that just a bit. Alright, that's better. Alright, so assuming these edges are parallel, then this would work as a layout. I'm going to mark that down over here. And I really only need to mark this from one edge, but I've gotten into the habit of marking from both just in case there's any variations. Alright, now what I'm going to do is create a center line on the edge in the same format of what we did before. And so I have a board that's just over 3/4 of an inch, so it'll be just slightly over 3/8. So whenever trying to figure out the math on fractions, if I have 3/4 and I multiply the denominator, and 2. So 3/4, if I leave the numerator the same, so 3, but multiply the denominator, that finds whatever half of the dimensions are. So half of 3/4 is 3/8, half of 1/2 is 1/4, half of so on and so forth. Okay, so I found center here, center there, flip this around, do the same. And I guess I just like marking all of these locations because I can get some references going where it is I need these things to be. Okay, so center line here on the edge, so or on the face of the board. So I can't see any of these things carry through. I can transfer this vertically, and I can start to bring up these dimensions. And so I have little location marks here which work. If I really wanted to see something on the end, and you're probably out of frame, but basically I just transferred a little notch here, or a mark with my pencil. I'll be able to carry those up in this position here, and hopefully these things will align and I should be in good shape. So the same trick I will do for marking the faces of the tenon board. So I'll be able to carry these things up. And I'm not terribly concerned about making sure these are totally accurate, but I do want to make sure that I have, as close as I possibly can, good information about where to locate these on both axes of this tenon board. So pencil lines are there. I'm going to double check them and lay them out a bit more accurately with a marking gauge. Okay, so the other thing I will do now is mark the length of this tenon, and so there's really no simpler way than just putting this face down, assuming this end is being cut square, if you want a square tenon, and then just transferring this thing up. For what we're doing, I want to make a proud tenon, so something that will extend by probably another 1/4 inch. So, and there's some methods to doing that as well. So from here, make a little mark by 1/4 inch. Yeah, 1/4 inch is good. Alright. Now I could use my marking gauge and start transferring this based off of the end of the board and flipping this thing around and go, and that's great. But I'm always a little worried about how accurate or how square the end of this board is. I can always check for square. I can set this across, check both ways, but I really have gotten into a habit of not trusting that as much when it comes to really fine work. So what I will do is lay down my knife, my marking knife, and then bring the square into that location or position. And then I'll be able to carry this around the board. And at this point, I'm not worried so much about the accuracy or squareness of the end of this tenon board, but I am worried about the accuracy of parallel on the two faces, perpendicular on the edges to the face, and then parallel edges. So the test is that this is the first mark that I made, and if you're going all the way around and those two lines line up, then you know your square is square and that these edges are parallel. If one of those were off, then these would not align. So I'm happy with where this one looks, or how this one looks. Okay, so next step here is I need to mark off one of my reference faces. So I'm going to use this as the reference. And from there, I need to measure out, oh there you are, my marks. So what I will do, leaving my marking gauge to the reference face, I want to carry this over, and that looks just a little bit short. And for those of you that might have a marking gauge that doesn't have a fine-tune adjustment, that's the right way to do it. Not tighten it fully, just give it a little tap here. We could tap the other way, and that will give us that micro adjustment piece that we really want. That looks pretty great. Alright. So what you probably can't see is that my shoulder line is going to be here, but I've made a line well past that just in case I need to trim some of this stuff off. I will still have those locations in place. The other thing The thing is, I'll typically cut one end first, and then I'll cut down to my final length, including whatever my overhang is for doing a proud tenon or whatever the case may call for. But if I've done that, then let me rephrase it. If I cut these to final length first, I really have nowhere else to go if I have made a mistake. So, okay. So reference face, I'm going to continue those marks on the end and then the other edge. And so those ones are well defined now. I hope you can see all of that. Great. So at this point, I can easily, my reference face is over here to my right, I can easily flip this one around and carry these things through. And that would probably work if these two faces are parallel. If there's ever a concern about that, especially if you're doing any hand tool work like hand planing one or both of these faces to get them down to their dimension, it's always much safer to do what I'm going to do and propose, which is going to be to still keep your marking gauge on the reference face and then mark these things off again, still referencing where we started. If I do this, then I'm guaranteed to have parallel lines from what it is that I want. So reference faces now to my left. And then I've gotten into the habit, as I think I talked about in an earlier video, about just scoring these lines with a pencil so I can really see what it is I want to cut. Because that's important. All right. Now I'm going to do a similar situation here. I'm going to make this my reference edge because I need to transfer over the lines that are going to dictate the width of my tenon. I just want to make sure you all can see this. Yeah, good. Hopefully it's in there. That looks great. So carrying that past my shoulder line onto the end of the board. Oops, something happened. I think I pushed too hard on my marking gauge. That looks much better. The other benefit of going back and identifying which line you want is that if you do have two lines here, you just don't mark with a pencil that secondary line, just the one that matters, just the one that we care about. Alright. And then I will reference edge, carry this over to my other line. Oops, I went a little too far. That's pretty good. Alright, cool. So now I have the layout for my joinery. And in the center of all of this maze or web of lines is going to live my tenon. So, good habit to mark out the areas of waste everywhere. And I will do the same on these guys. That's all waste there and there. Okay, so just double checking, that looks pretty great. Maybe a little bit heavier than I want, that looks pretty great. Maybe the same deal, maybe just a little bit thicker than I want, which is actually a good problem to have. Once I've got that, then it's ready to start cutting these things. So let me get reset and we'll talk about how to cut. Let's go.